All right, so now we're going to learn about promises. A promise is an object that represents the eventual completion or the failure of an asynchronous operation. So the concept is that a promise is made just like you would make to a person, but it's a promise to, I guess, your script that it'll complete some kind of task or operation, such as fetching data from a server, some asynchronous operation. Meanwhile, the rest of the code will continue to execute. So it's asynchronous and non-blocking. When the task is complete, the promise is either fulfilled or rejected. And it also prevents us from entering callback hell, which, as you know, are multiple nested callbacks, as we saw in the previous video. Now, I want to stress that most of the time, until you get into more advanced JavaScript, you're going to be dealing with the response from a promise, not writing them. For instance, when you use the fetch API, it returns a promise, so you need to know what to do with that promise and how to handle it. Now, in this video, I'll show you how to deal with them, but I'm also going to show you how to create them using the promise constructor. Now, a few videos ago when we looked at callbacks, remember we had the get post and create post function, and we used a callback in order to first create the post and then get them. In the next video, we're going to refactor that using promises. But in this video, I'm just going to give you a very basic syntax of how to create a promise and how to handle them. So we're going to say const promise, and the way we create a promise is with the promise constructor, and we do that by saying new promise. Now this takes in a function, can be a regular function or arrow, and then we're going to pass in two params, resolve and reject. So basically when the promise completes and it's successful, we call resolve. If there's some kind of error and the promise can't be fulfilled, then we call reject. So to kind of simulate an asynchronous task, I'm going to use set timeout. And you see this all the time because set timeout allows us to basically wait until we do something, and that simulates, for instance, fetching data from a server because you have to wait for the data to come back. So let's just put a comment here and say do some async task. All right, and I'll put a comment up here. This is to create a promise. All right, so do some async task. So the function where we want to run it, and then the time we want to wait, I'm just going to do 1,000, 1 second. And let's just do a console log, and we'll say async task complete. And then we just want to call resolve because we want to resolve the promise. Everything went okay. All right, now to handle the promise, we can then take the promise variable, okay, which we set here. We set the promise to this variable. And the way that we handle it is we do dot then, not them, dot then. Okay, now this takes in a callback function. And what we get here is anything that we pass into resolve. Now I didn't pass anything into resolve in this case, so I'm just gonna console log, let's say we'll say promise consumed. All right, so if I save this, after a second the async task is done and we get promise consumed. Now just to demonstrate that this is asynchronous, in the global scope I'll just say hello from global scope. And if we run this, we're going to see hello from global scope first. So it's non-blocking, right? It didn't have to wait until this stuff was done to run this line here. This line was run immediate. This happened in the background asynchronously. It went through, remember that diagram I showed you, it goes through the micro task queue. Okay, it doesn't go through the same task queue that most callbacks go through. All right, now a lot of times you might see the dot then put on the actual promise instead of on a variable. So for example, I guess we could just copy this right here, paste that in, and we'll say async task to complete. And then what I'm going to do is put a dot then right on this. Okay, so we'll say dot then, and we'll say promise, or console log, and say promise to consumed. So we'll save that. Okay, so we see hello from global scope first, right? Because this is non-blocking. Async task complete, promise consumed. Async task 2 complete, promise 2 consumed. So you can put it in a variable and call dot then on the variable, or you can put it right on the promise itself. Now, a lot of times you're going to want to return some data from a promise. So to do that, we would just pass that into resolve. So what I'll do is in the second one, I'm going to get rid of that console log. And in resolve, let's say we have a user we want to pass. So we'll say name John, and we'll say age 30. Okay, so now when we catch the promise in this dot then, or when we handle it, we can take in here whatever we want to call that. I'll call it user, and then let's come over here and get rid of this, and let's console log user. So now if we save, the first promise will run, and then the second one runs, and it gives us this data back. Now I want to show you how to handle errors. So I think what I'm going to do is create a variable here, and we'll just call this get user and set that to this promise, and then we can call, say, get user dot then. That'll give us the same result. Now as far as errors go, let's get rid of this comment. So I'm just going to basically set a flag for an error. So we'll say let error and set that to false. And then let's come down here and let's have an if statement, and we'll say if not error, then let's resolve and give the user else. So if there is an error, then we're going to reject. And then we can pass in here, let's say error colon something, let's say something went wrong. All right, now if I save, we're going to get the same result. Let's actually comment out this first one. Okay, so we get our user. Now if I set this error to true and save, notice what we get. It says uncaught in promise. So it's an uncaught error. It does say something went wrong, but it's uncaught. To catch your errors, you're actually going to use .catch. So after the dot then, usually we'll split this up onto multiple lines. We'll say .catch. That takes in a function, and that is going to be whatever the error is that you pass in to reject. So then we'll console.log and pass in here error. Okay, looks like prettier makes me put this all in one line, but now you can see we don't get that red uncaught message now. We just get error, something went wrong, because that's what I passed into my reject. So we'll put that back to false, and then we should get the user. Now, the last thing I want to show you is finally. You can put on finally on promises as well, and what that'll do is it'll run no matter what, whether the promise is resolved or rejected. So once again, I'm going to put these on separate lines, and then I'm also going to add a dot finally, which will take, oops, we need to get rid of that semicolon at the end there. So finally, and then that takes in an arrow function, and I'll say console log, and we'll just say the promise has been resolved or rejected, because it will run either way. So now if I save that, we should see the user, and then we should see whatever is passed in finally. Even if the error is true and the reject is called, we still see the finally. And I honestly don't use this very much. But yeah, so this is the most important part to understand, in my opinion, right now for you guys that are just learning, because there's not going to be too many times you're going to have to create a promise until you get into more advanced JavaScript. When we use the fetch API, this is excuse me, this is what you do. You'll do fetch, pass in the endpoint you want to hit, and then add on a dot then. So you'll already know how to handle that with the fetch API. All right, now in the next video, like I said, I want to take that code that we wrote to create posts and get posts, where we use callbacks, and refactor it into promises.